Today we're going to take a look at a huge sign and trade. It almost came together early in NHL free agency involving the Montreal Canadiens and the Edmonton Oilers, but it saw significant defensemen changing both sides. And of course, we also want to take a look at the latest updates on players like Tyler Bertuzzi, JT Miller, plus huge news in coaching. Mike Babcock apparently is retiring. We'll discuss all the latest coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. As I mentioned, we have a variety of things to discuss today. First up, we get word that longtime NHL coach Mike Babcock is apparently retiring from the world of hockey coaching. Now, of course, he recently resigned in the last few days at the University of Saskatchewan, where he only coached for one season, but that was part of the plan all along. He coached the team last year to a record of 14-9, so a decent regular season, but lost out in the first round of the playoffs. So it wasn't an overly successful year, but obviously wanted to return back to his home province. And obviously this was a volunteer coaching position as well. Wanted to give back to the university and, coach at that level for one season. That was always part of the plan, but there were some that wondered maybe if he might, have a good time, enjoy the role, and maybe, decide to stay on there. But that's not apparently in the cards. He says it's always been part of his plan to retire around the age of 60. He's 59 years old now, so it doesn't make sense to, try to continue on and, go into any kind of a long-term commitment. Now, of course, he was recently, in the past couple of years, a candidate in a variety of NHL jobs. There was one that was like Washington, for example, before they hired Peter Laviolette. That was obviously a couple of years back. Never got the job there, but he does say that he's talked to several other teams and explored several other opportunities since his release from the Maple Leafs, but feels that, he's enjoyed that as well. He said he enjoyed exploring those chances, but feels this is the right thing to do right now for himself and his family. But he also made a quote saying that, right now that if things change, I guess they change, but that's not the plan. I would be willing to say that pretty good odds, which at this point, I don't know if it's going to happen. You have to wonder what the odds would be. I'm going to say probably not great, but you never know. If an NHL team comes calling with an opportunity that he's seen as a really great chance to do something big in the NHL, that he would probably want to take advantage of that. I know he saw the opportunity with the Leafs organization as being just that. Of course, things didn't really work out the greatest there. Had some decent success to saw the team grow, but ultimately couldn't get over that hump and was let go. And of course, he ran into a lot of other issues since all of that came together. We learned about the situation between he and Mitch Marner, which he had already apologized to Marner about, and other players have come forward since then, talking about how unpleasant of an experience it was being coached by him. Now, of course, there's lots of players who will speak up and say he was a great coach and had a great experience as well. But, there's certainly some people that weren't pleased with Mr. Babcock. That much we can say for sure. Certainly before his time in Toronto, though, he had a terrific run between his time with the Anaheim Ducks and Detroit Red Wings. Probably Detroit was the team he had the most success with at the NHL level. Of course, he was also very successful internationally, mind you. One of the greatest teams I think that we've seen in recent history was that 2014 Olympic Canadian team that won the gold medal. But he won multiple gold medals as a coach at the Olympics. But that one of those teams were phenomenal teams too. So as much as he had to do a good job, it's not as much of a task as it would be with an NHL team. But it can be challenging, managing all those big names, big personalities, and kind of keeping everybody, reminded of the end goal. But like I said, they were terrific, awesome teams that I do wonder if a different coach could have possibly accomplished the same thing, but at the end of the day, he did get it done and deserves credit as well. So he's had a great career. For the most part, things didn't end really on a great note. Leaving Toronto, amount of term left on that contract. He signed a long-term deal to be there, which was an unprecedented amount of term and money at the time when the Maple Leafs signed him to that long-term mega contract. And, at the time, it kind of helped coaches kind of work their way up the pecking order here in the NHL when it comes to making more money. But at the same time, since then, I think teams might have been a little bit leery to go as long and as big as what they were seen in Toronto, since it didn't really work out. But we'll see if he ever re-emerges into the world of hockey in any capacity. But for right now, his words say that he's retired. So we'll see if this is indeed the end for Mike Babcock as a professional hockey coach. Now, on to a few other players quickly here. I do want to talk about the sign and trade between Edmonton and Montreal that almost materialized earlier this offseason, but obviously a few other updates first. More reports from Detroit Hockey Now indicating that there are indeed sources, different sources that we've talked about before, that believe that there's a chance that Tyler Bertuzzi is indeed on the trade market with the Detroit Red Wings. So, of course, he's going into the final year of his contract. We don't have any real set rumors on an extension being worked on, or if there has been. I don't know that there's really been deep discussions or a lot of progress at this point. Fair to say, given Bertuzzi getting into his late 20s and having some fairly productive seasons the past couple of years, that he's probably going to be looking for a long-term deal and some bigger money. I know obviously Detroit last year, he had a good season, a really good season, but it's unfortunate he wasn't able to play in games in Canada. Certainly missed a decent amount of time due to the rules around the travel and vaccine and all that, which was, certainly impacted him more than any other NHL player for sure because of the fact that he wasn't vaccinated. And obviously, you do wonder with the Red Wings what their plans are. I mean, they have a young team, but they also went out in this offseason and they added a lot more help. So they're certainly looking to make some strides to get better. Most of the players they added are still, I guess there's a mixture there. I mean, you got a guy like Andrew Kopp, who's, getting into the second half of his 20s now. Was going to be a UFA for the first time, around that 26, 27 range. And then, of course, you got David Perron, who's a little bit older into his 30s. So they want to insulate those young, really good-looking players that they have on that team, right? And obviously a guy like Bertuzzi, it's hard to say. I don't think they necessarily want to move on from him, but we did see them move Anthony Mantha, and they could do the same with him if contract negotiations don't go well. Personally, I think this is going to be a scenario where it's really going to boil down to contract negotiations and how they go. I think if Bertuzzi will work out a deal that Yzerman's happy with, then there's a chance he stays. But if he's looking for that, 8-year deal, big money, I don't know that Detroit has the appetite for that, so we'll have to wait and see. But Bertuzzi is going to be one of the more interesting names. I know Detroit, with the moves they've made, are at least expected to, if they don't make the playoffs, at least compete for a playoff spot, and should be at least still in the conversation going into the second half of the year, deeper into the season for sure. It's hard to say what's going to happen with teams like Detroit, Ottawa, Buffalo. Many feel that Ottawa and Detroit have improved a substantial amount this offseason. Buffalo probably not quite so much. And then they can at least be, in the conversation with teams like the Bruins for that, maybe the final playoff spot in the East. But it's hard to say if they can get ahead of Boston or not. Boston's still pretty, veteran team, good looking on paper. But of course, they have a lot of injuries they can deal with too. So, hard to say. But if they're not in the conversation, I would expect Bertuzzi could become one of those top names at the trade deadline that we could keep an eye on. Now in Vancouver and JT Miller, more reports on The Athletic in the last couple of days here indicating that all indications point to JT Miller and his agent cutting off negotiations once the season starts. So Jim Rutherford, Patrick Allvin, and the Vancouver Canucks do not have a lot of time to get a deal worked out here before they won't have any more time to do so. And if they say they don't want to negotiate in season, and if they don't have a deal done, that is, which is at this point, probably, I think the odds are great that the season will start and Miller won't be extended. Things can change in a heartbeat, but right now, that is certainly the way things look. And there hasn't been any reports of any real meaningful dialogue or real progress on any kind of an extension between the two sides. I think there's an appetite from both sides to stay and work something out, but at the same time, it seems like they're worlds apart on what they see that deal looking like. So it's difficult to see something getting accomplished right now. But like I said, one team or one player can have a change of heart, change their mind on something, and then all of a sudden things flip and something else materializes. You just never know. There's wild cards all the time. But right now, if Miller and his agent don't want to negotiate in season, I think that pretty much secures his fate as being a trade target this year. I think the Vancouver Canucks can be like Detroit and Ottawa, like we were talking about here with Miller, or with Bertuzzi, sorry. I think Miller and the Canucks can be in the conversation, but I think they're going to have a tough time getting into the playoffs. I think if we see Edmonton and Calgary are still likely going to be, I would think, near the top of that division. You get a team like Vegas, if they can stay healthy, although their goaltending will be a question mark. Then, of course, LA had a solid year last year, made the playoffs. They will be tough for Vancouver to get ahead of. So, I mean, a lot of people see Vancouver as probably being around 5th place in the Pacific. They should finish ahead of teams like San Jose and Seattle, probably Anaheim. Like, those are all teams that I can see maybe finishing below the Canucks. But Vancouver, I mean, you just never know, right? Things can change. They might be able to outplay Vegas or LA, but it's not going to be an easy task. And it is quite possible that as we get later into the year, they could find themselves in that predicament. Now, of course, last year was a little bit different. They brought in Bruce Boudreau. They made a good run. Didn't quite work out, but it certainly made things interesting. Could they do the same this year? Sure they could. But if they're not in a playoff spot, they're not going to let JT Miller walk for nothing. That much is a given. I wouldn't be shocked, to be honest, that even if they're trending towards maybe even being a bubble playoff team, that we could still possibly see a deal. If they can't extend him, I just don't see them taking a chance of letting him walk for nothing in the offseason. So Miller, to me, if the agent has cut off negotiations as expected and the deal is not reached before the season starts, he's as good as traded by the deadline, in my opinion. Now, as I mentioned, according to Elliotte Friedman here, we had a scenario unfolding earlier this offseason where we almost saw a significant sign and trade. Now, of course, we saw a scenario where John Klingberg was one of the top UFAs on the market that took an extended period of time to come to terms. We saw other names like Nazem Kadri, even Paul Stastny and a few others, even though they were prominent names and were, highly expected to get a contract. It was not a matter of not getting signed for some of these players. It was deciding on where they were going to go for starters. And secondly, a big thing that played a role for a lot of these guys is teams moving out other money to try to make salary cap space. Now, some of these teams are trying to get creative together and say, okay, well, we'd like to sign this player, but we don't have the room. So instead of signing him and then trying to make a move after, then you're at a position of weakness, and teams know that you need to become cap compliant, so they're going to take advantage of you and obviously, really ream you on a trade. Work out something ahead of time. So, okay, so what Edmonton and Montreal were talking about is we know that the Montreal Canadiens had already traded Jeff Petrie. They certainly are looking for another right shot defenseman who can play a similar type of role, but ideally somebody with less term and a little cheaper, but hopefully somebody experienced to take the pressure off a lot of their young defensemen that are in the system and could play and fill that role, but they'd rather be more patient with them as the rebuild gets fully underway this year. Of course, last year, it's fair to say, wasn't a good year either, but we only saw the beginning of things with a few trades, and I think we're going to see a lot more materialize with Montreal throughout this year coming. I think by the end of this year coming, at the deadline, the team could look drastically different. So a guy like Tyson Barrie, who's been heavily rumored to be a potential cost-cutting measure for Edmonton if they found other means to upgrade the team, likely was involved in this scenario. So how it would have happened is Montreal would have signed Klingberg for the Edmonton Oilers. Of course, the Oilers likely would have been involved in the negotiations. It's quite possible that the Montreal Canadiens would have then retained some of that contract. Now, I don't imagine it would have been for too long. He ended up signing a one-year deal, of course, with the Anaheim Ducks. I'm not sure if it would have been a one-year deal. Elliotte Friedman didn't go on to say what the likely contract terms would have been if this would have worked out, but I don't think it would have been very long. I'm guessing 1 or 2 seasons is probably all it would have been. Of course, Klingberg would have had an opportunity to play on a cup-contending team, a team that went deep in the playoffs last year, and obviously they likely would have felt that Klingberg would have been an upgrade over a guy like Barrie. Now, even though Friedman himself did not mention Barrie as being involved, it makes total sense that he would have been the prime player going to the Habs in this scenario, given the fact, if you look at the power play, they already have Evan Bouchard, they already have Darnell Nurse, they already have Cody Ceci who plays the right side. They don't need yet another right shot defenseman, and Barrie with 2 years left at $4.5 million would become expendable. It's just that simple, and I think they would view Klingberg as likely being a bit of an upgrade over Barrie. So it makes sense that Montreal would sign him, retain a little bit of the money to knock the cap hit down, and they likely would have traded, I'm guessing, Tyson Barrie, a draft pick for the retention. Maybe even Warren Foegele could have been included as well, since he doesn't have much term in his contract. We know the Habs are kind of in a habit here of accumulating some short-term deals of players who they can basically either use or rehab and hopefully flip for a pick maybe later into the season at the deadline. And Foegele could have possibly been one of those players. So I don't know for sure that Foegele would have been included, but I think it's fair to say that a draft pick for the retention and Barrie for sure would have been what would have went to Montreal. And of course, Edmonton would now have John Klingberg playing in the top four as a right shot defenseman. You'd have Klingberg and Bouchard and Cody Ceci on your right side. I think they would be quite pleased with that. Montreal would have Tyson Barrie, which would have replaced obviously Jeff Petrie, who departed, and that's how Edmonton could have got himself in the UFA rather than sign Klingberg and then go to market and try to move some money out to become salary cap compliant. It's just a creative way that some of these teams were talking to each other about helping each other out. Obviously, when everybody's tight up against the cap and there's not a lot of teams with salary cap space, sometimes you can find creative ways to go about things and to kind of help each other's needs. And that's a scenario that we could have seen. Now, there's not a given. Maybe Jesse Puljujarvi would have been a player included as well. Doesn't necessarily have to have been a draft pick for the efforts here going to Montreal, but it's something with some type of a future asset, whether it be Puljujarvi, who at the time would have been an unsigned RFA, or a pick or something, and Barrie would have been also there. So would have been a good deal for Montreal to rent out some cap space in order to bring in a player like Tyson Barrie. Of course, at that point, they may not have had confirmation yet that Carey Price was unlikely going to play. They may not have realized or known the full extent of their potential LTIR pool that they would have had at their disposal. And ultimately, depending on the money that Klingberg wanted and what they would have had to retain, it certainly didn't work out. But it's an interesting thing to look back on and say, well, geez, what would that have been like if it would have? Things would certainly look different here for sure. We know Montreal's still looking for a right shot defenseman. They'd love to move out a forward or two to make that happen, and that's something that we'll likely see materialize sometime either before the season or early into the year once teams and rosters become set, and other teams might have some players that might become expendable at that point once we complete that. So we'll see, but it's something interesting to look back on and look, obviously, even though it didn't happen, just to see what could have been had those talks progressed and something come together. So let me know your thoughts on a pretty huge trade that almost happened, as well as the other topics discussed here today down in the comments. We'll discuss further. If you're new to the channel, of course, make sure you subscribe and stick around. We'll keep you up to date with the latest news, rumors, and analysis on all 32 NHL teams. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.